"Sir, step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where we can see them." The command cut through the quiet morning air so sharply that conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips, and every curious face in the parking lot slowly turned toward the same lonely figure standing beside a dark gray SUV. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the two police officers approaching him with the calm expression of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping his composure when everyone else lost theirs. Marcus Ellison slowly lifted both hands, his weathered fingers catching the soft October sunlight as a cool breeze drifted across the Memorial Plaza in Arlington, Virginia. Fallen maple leaves rolled gently across the pavement, brushing against polished granite monuments where families quietly gathered with flowers, flags, and photographs of loved ones who had never come home. Marcus wore faded jeans, worn brown boots, and an old Navy windbreaker that had clearly seen better years. His silver hair peeked from beneath a plain black baseball cap with no military insignia, no medals, nothing that hinted at the decades of service hidden behind his quiet eyes. To almost everyone watching, he looked like an ordinary older black man lingering near an expensive vehicle that someone believed couldn't possibly belong to him. Officer Ethan Brooks slowed as he reached Marcus, his hand resting near his duty belt while his younger partner, Officer Daniel Hayes, circled cautiously toward the passenger side of the SUV. Neither officer sounded angry. They sounded certain. They had received a report of a suspicious individual repeatedly walking around a luxury vehicle, opening the driver's door, closing it again, and remaining in the parking lot without leaving. Someone nearby had called because, in their words, something didn't seem right. Marcus glanced once toward the memorial fountain where an American flag moved gently against the pale blue sky before returning his attention to the officers. "Good morning, officers," he said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "We received a complaint. Until we verify everything, we'd like you to remain where you are." Marcus gave a slow nod. Of course. His voice carried no irritation, only quiet patience. Around them, phones quietly appeared. One teenager lowered his backpack and started recording. An elderly couple exchanged uncertain glances before stepping farther away. A woman pushing a stroller whispered something to her husband as they paused near a row of white stone benches. The entire parking lot seemed to inhale at once, waiting for whatever came next. Daniel looked through the SUV's windows, then back toward Marcus. "Is this your vehicle?" Marcus answered simply, "Yes, sir." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Ethan looked toward the license plate, then back toward the older man standing calmly beside him. The silence stretched just long enough for doubt to settle over the growing crowd. Marcus never shifted his feet. Instead, he watched the sunlight shimmer across the marble memorial ahead of him. Every year, on this exact morning, he came alone carrying the same small wooden presentation case, tucked carefully beneath his arm. Inside rested folded memories that mattered far more than anything parked behind him. Ethan noticed the box. "Sir, what's inside?" Marcus looked down briefly before answering. "Things that belonged to men who never made it home." Before either officer could respond, the distant hum of a powerful diesel engine echoed across the plaza. At first, almost nobody paid attention. It sounded like another government vehicle moving through the streets surrounding the cemetery. But within seconds the sound grew louder. Heads turned. A dark military transport rolled slowly through the entrance gate, sunlight reflecting across its windshield. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't using emergency lights. It simply moved with quiet purpose directly toward the parking lot, where Marcus still stood surrounded by curious strangers. The vehicle came to a smooth stop only a few yards away. For one long heartbeat, nobody moved. The driver's door opened. The driver stepped onto the pavement with the deliberate confidence of someone who had repeated the same movement thousands of times. His neatly pressed service uniform caught the morning light, every crease perfectly aligned, every polished shoe reflecting the marble walkway beneath him. Before anyone could understand why a military vehicle had stopped beside an ordinary parking lot, the man closed his door, took exactly 3 measured steps forward, and came to a flawless halt directly in front of Marcus Ellison. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he raised his right hand in a textbook military salute. "Good morning, General." Master Sergeant Ryan Cooper reporting as ordered. His voice carried across the silent plaza, calm, disciplined, and unmistakably respectful. The words seemed to freeze the air itself. Officer Ethan Brooks instinctively looked toward his partner, wondering if he had heard correctly. Daniel Hayes blinked twice, his expression changing from certainty to confusion. Around them, the crowd that had been quietly recording suddenly lowered their phones just enough to exchange uncertain glances. A little boy standing beside his grandfather whispered, "Did he just call him General?" His grandfather did not answer. He simply stared. Marcus returned the salute with effortless precision, the motion so natural that it appeared woven into his very posture. "At ease, Sergeant," he said with a gentle smile. Ryan relaxed immediately, though his posture remained impeccably straight. "I apologize for arriving a few minutes behind schedule, sir. Traffic entering the memorial grounds was heavier than expected." Marcus gave a small nod. "No apology necessary. We are all here for the same reason today." Ethan stepped forward cautiously. "Excuse me, sir." Ryan turned toward him, his professional expression never changing. "Yes, officer." Ethan glanced from Ryan to Marcus and back again. "You know this gentleman?" Ryan looked almost puzzled by the question. "Know him?" He paused politely before answering. "General Marcus Ellison commanded the 1st Expeditionary Division during Operation Iron Horizon. I served under his leadership for nearly 6 years." Silence settled over the group once again. The words did not sound exaggerated. They sounded factual, spoken with the quiet confidence of someone describing yesterday's weather. Daniel looked toward Marcus, whose expression remained remarkably peaceful despite every curious eye now fixed upon him. The older man still held the small wooden presentation case carefully against his side, as though protecting something infinitely more valuable than its polished walnut exterior suggested. Ryan noticed the box and smiled faintly. "You still carry it yourself every year." Marcus looked down at the case. "Some traditions are too important to delegate." Ryan nodded without another question. He already understood. Inside that carefully preserved box rested folded letters, unit photographs, worn dog tags, and service medals belonging not to Marcus alone, but to soldiers whose families had asked him to keep their memories alive during the annual remembrance ceremony. He had never considered those items personal achievements. They were promises. Promises made decades earlier that no sacrifice would ever be forgotten. Nearby, the breeze lifted a small American flag planted beside one of the memorial stones. The fabric fluttered softly, almost rhythmically, as though keeping time with memories that refused to fade. Ethan quietly cleared his throat. "General, we received a report concerning the vehicle." Marcus answered before Ryan could speak. "The officers are simply doing the job they were asked to do." His calm response surprised everyone standing nearby. There was no accusation, no frustration, only quiet dignity. Ryan studied Marcus for a brief moment before giving a respectful nod. He had witnessed that same steady composure years earlier under circumstances far more difficult than an uncomfortable misunderstanding in a parking lot. It was one of the reasons so many soldiers still spoke of Marcus Ellison with admiration long after retirement. Yet even as the tension appeared ready to dissolve, another black government sedan rolled slowly through the memorial entrance. Its small row of flags mounted near the hood immediately caught Ryan's attention. His expression became noticeably more formal. He straightened instinctively and quietly murmured, "Sir, I believe the delegation has arrived earlier than expected." The second sedan rolled to a gentle stop behind the military transport, its dark paint reflecting the white marble monuments surrounding the memorial plaza. Small American flags mounted on each front fender fluttered quietly in the cool breeze, signaling that whoever had arrived carried official responsibility rather than ceremony alone. Before the engine had fully gone silent, 2 uniformed aides stepped out first, scanning the area with calm professionalism instead of urgency. They opened the rear passenger door, and an older man wearing a perfectly tailored service dress uniform emerged with measured confidence. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, for polished stars gleamed from each shoulder, and decades of leadership seemed to follow every deliberate step he took across the pavement. Conversations disappeared almost instantly. Even visitors who knew little about military ranks recognized that someone of extraordinary authority had just entered the memorial grounds. Master Sergeant Ryan Cooper immediately returned to attention. His posture became perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward. Marcus Ellison remained where he was, the wooden presentation case resting comfortably beneath one arm. His expression did not change. He looked toward the approaching officer with the quiet warmth reserved for an old friend rather than a superior. Officer Ethan Brooks felt his heartbeat quicken. He exchanged another uncertain glance with Daniel Hayes, both realizing the situation had become far more significant than either had imagined only minutes earlier. The four-star general stopped several feet from Marcus before offering a broad smile that softened the distinguished features of his face. Then, in full view of everyone gathered around the memorial, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. "General Ellison," he said respectfully, "it is an honor to see you again." Marcus immediately returned the salute. "General Whitmore, thank you for coming." The two men shook hands warmly, not with the stiff formality of strangers, but with the familiarity of leaders who had carried enormous responsibilities together many years before. General Nathan Whitmore glanced briefly at the wooden case Marcus carried and nodded knowingly. "You still bring them yourself?" Marcus smiled gently. "I promised I always would." Whitmore lowered his voice slightly. "They would be proud." Those simple words seemed heavier than any speech. Ryan quietly looked toward the memorial wall, understanding exactly who the conversation honored. Ethan noticed it as well. Whatever rested inside that polished wooden case clearly represented something much larger than medals or official documents. It carried memories that neither rank nor time could replace. General Whitmore finally turned toward the officers with a courteous expression. "Good morning, gentlemen." Ethan straightened instinctively. "Good morning, sir." Whitmore offered a polite nod before asking calmly, "Has there been some misunderstanding?" Ethan hesitated. His carefully practiced confidence had faded into visible uncertainty. "We received a report from a caller who believed the gentleman beside the vehicle appeared suspicious. We responded according to procedure." Whitmore listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the general simply nodded once. "I appreciate that you answered the call professionally." Relief briefly crossed Ethan's face before Whitmore continued in the same calm tone. "However, I would encourage every officer, every soldier, and every public servant to remember that appearance alone rarely tells the full story of the person standing before you." No accusation entered his voice. No anger colored his words. The statement landed with quiet weight precisely because it was spoken without bitterness. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes. Around the parking lot, several bystanders slipped their phones back into their pockets. What had begun as curiosity was gradually becoming reflection. A young college student folded his arms thoughtfully while an elderly veteran removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest. Marcus never attempted to draw attention to himself. Instead, he looked beyond the gathering crowd toward the long rows of white headstones stretching across the hillside beneath the bright autumn sky. The breeze carried the faint sound of distant bugle practice somewhere deeper inside the cemetery. It reminded him why he had come. Then General Whitmore glanced at his watch and quietly said, "Sir, the Gold Star families have already assembled. They have been waiting for you to lead the remembrance procession." The entire parking lot fell silent once again. Marcus Ellison looked at General Nathan Whitmore for a long moment before offering the same quiet smile he had worn since arriving that morning. "Then we should not keep them waiting," he said softly. He shifted the polished wooden case into both hands with remarkable care, almost as though every inch of it deserved respect. The smooth walnut surface reflected streaks of autumn sunlight filtering through rows of crimson and golden trees that lined the memorial road. General Whitmore nodded once and stepped slightly aside, silently inviting Marcus to lead the way exactly as tradition demanded. Before taking his first step, Marcus turned toward officers Ethan Brooks and Daniel Hayes. Neither officer spoke. Ethan's shoulders seemed noticeably heavier than they had only minutes earlier. Daniel avoided meeting Marcus's eyes altogether, replaying every assumption he had made since responding to the dispatch call. Marcus broke the silence with the same calm voice that had never once risen above ordinary conversation. "Gentlemen, thank you for responding to the call. I know you were trying to protect the community." Ethan finally looked up, surprised by the kindness in those words. "Sir, I think we should have asked more questions before reaching conclusions." Marcus gave a gentle nod. Questions are often the shortest road to understanding. The sentence lingered quietly in the cool morning air. Nobody hurried to fill the silence that followed. Even the visitors scattered throughout the memorial grounds seemed unwilling to interrupt the unexpected lesson unfolding before them. A young woman who had been recording earlier slowly lowered her phone completely. Beside her, an elderly veteran removed his glasses and wiped them with a folded handkerchief before placing them back on with careful hands. Ryan Cooper stepped toward the rear of the military transport and opened the cargo compartment. Inside rested a ceremonial wreath woven with white lilies, blue delphiniums, and deep red roses surrounding a carefully folded American flag ribbon. Two uniformed soldiers approached without a word, lifting the wreath together with practiced precision. The surrounding crowd instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path toward the memorial plaza. As Marcus began walking, he remained several feet ahead of everyone else, carrying only the wooden presentation case beneath one arm. He did not walk like a retired celebrity expecting recognition. He walked like a man returning to old friends whose names deserved to be spoken one more time. The crisp sound of polished military shoes echoed softly across the stone walkway as General Whitmore, Ryan Cooper, and the honor detail followed behind him. Families standing near the memorial gradually noticed the approaching procession. One by one, conversations faded into respectful silence. Parents gently placed comforting hands on their children's shoulders. Elderly mothers clutched framed photographs against their chests. Fathers wearing faded service caps stood a little straighter despite the passing years. A little girl holding a bouquet of yellow flowers looked toward her grandmother and whispered, "Who is that man?" The older woman watched Marcus for several seconds before quietly answering, "Someone who remembers." The simple reply carried more meaning than the child could fully understand. Ethan remained standing beside the SUV, watching the procession slowly move away. Daniel exhaled deeply, finally breaking the silence between them. "I almost saw nothing except what I expected to see." Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off Marcus. "So did I." Neither officer attempted to justify what had happened. The realization settling over them needed no explanation. General Whitmore glanced back once and noticed the two officers still standing motionless where everything had begun. He leaned slightly toward Marcus as they continued walking. "They will remember today." Marcus smiled faintly without slowing his pace. "I hope they remember tomorrow even more." Ahead, the memorial courtyard opened beneath a brilliant blue sky where dozens of American flags moved gently in the steady breeze. Waiting beside the central monument stood rows of Gold Star families, veterans from every generation, active duty service members, and military cadets dressed in immaculate uniforms. As Marcus stepped into the open courtyard carrying the weathered wooden case, every conversation disappeared. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him at exactly the same moment, and then, without anyone giving a command, people throughout the entire plaza slowly rose to their feet. The quiet that settled over the memorial courtyard felt different from ordinary silence. It carried the weight of thousands of memories resting beneath rows of white marble stretching across the hillside. Marcus Ellison walked slowly toward the central monument, never looking left or right, never acknowledging the hundreds of eyes following him. His attention remained fixed on the names engraved into polished stone and on the promises he had made long ago to the families standing only a few yards away. General Nathan Whitmore remained one respectful step behind him, allowing the retired commander to lead exactly as he always had on this day each year. The honor detail stopped beside the monument and carefully lowered the ceremonial wreath onto its stand. The bright red, white, and blue flowers glowed beneath the clear autumn sky, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and fallen leaves across the open courtyard. Marcus slowly knelt beside the memorial, resting the wooden presentation case upon the smooth granite surface. His fingers paused for a brief moment before releasing the polished brass latch. The small click echoed far louder than anyone expected. Inside rested neatly folded letters, carefully preserved photographs faded by time, worn military identification tags, and dozens of service medals that reflected tiny flashes of sunlight. There was no display of personal achievement. Every item belonged to someone else. Every medal carried another family's story. Marcus gently lifted one photograph and held it for only a second before placing it beside the wreath. A gray-haired woman standing in the front row suddenly pressed both hands against her mouth. Tears quietly filled her eyes. "That is my son," she whispered, barely able to speak. Marcus looked toward her with a warm smile that held more compassion than words could express. "Captain Michael Jensen asked me to make sure you would always know he was remembered." The woman nodded through quiet tears, unable to answer. Beside her, another father stepped forward as Marcus carefully removed a pair of weathered identification tags from the case. "Lieutenant Carlos Ramirez carried these until his final mission," Marcus said softly. "He once told me that courage was not about being fearless. It was about making certain the person beside you made it home." The older man accepted the tags with trembling hands and closed his fingers around them, as though embracing his son one more time. One by one, Marcus continued opening memories instead of awards. Every letter carried a handwritten promise. Every photograph held a forgotten smile. Every carefully preserved keepsake returned a small piece of someone's loved one back to waiting hands. No speech had been prepared for this moment because none was needed. The stories themselves spoke louder than any ceremony ever could. Ethan Brooks and Daniel Hayes had quietly walked to the edge of the gathering without anyone noticing. They stood together behind the final row of visitors, hats held respectfully in front of them, watching families receive pieces of history that Marcus had protected for years without seeking recognition. Ethan felt an uncomfortable tightness settle in his chest. He realized that while he had judged a stranger within moments, this man had quietly devoted decades to protecting memories that belonged to people he could never replace. Daniel stared at the wooden case, understanding now why Marcus had guarded it so carefully in the parking lot. It had never been about protecting possessions. It had been about protecting trust. General Whitmore watched the families embracing photographs, medals, and letters that many believed they would never see again. He quietly leaned toward Ryan Cooper and spoke just above a whisper. "There is a reason every soldier who served under him still calls him General before they call him anything else." Ryan nodded. "Because he never stopped taking care of his people." Whitmore smiled faintly. "Exactly." At that very moment, the distant sound of a lone bugle drifted across the cemetery. Every head slowly turned toward the hill overlooking the memorial, where the first notes floated gently through the crisp morning air. Marcus closed the wooden case with careful hands, stood slowly, and removed his cap. Without a single command being spoken, every service member, every veteran, every police officer, and every visitor throughout the courtyard instinctively followed his example. The final note of the bugle lingered in the crisp autumn air long after the musician had lowered the instrument. No one moved. The breeze drifted gently across the hillside, carrying the soft rustle of hundreds of American flags planted beside rows of white marble headstones. Sunlight settled warmly across the memorial, painting long shadows that stretched quietly between generations of sacrifice. Marcus Ellison remained standing with his cap held respectfully against his heart, his eyes fixed not on the crowd surrounding him, but on the endless rows of names that had shaped the course of his life. For several peaceful moments, the world seemed to slow to the rhythm of memory itself. General Nathan Whitmore stood beside him without speaking. Ryan Cooper remained perfectly still with the honor detail, every soldier understanding that silence sometimes honored service better than applause ever could. Families held one another gently. Some smiled through quiet tears while others simply closed their eyes, allowing old memories to return without resistance. A young boy reached for his mother's hand and whispered, "Why is everyone so quiet?" She squeezed his fingers gently before answering in a voice barely above the wind. "Because some people gave us the chance to live ordinary days like this one." The child looked across the rows of flags and slowly nodded, as though he understood more than anyone expected. At the edge of the gathering, Officer Ethan Brooks stood with his service cap resting against his chest. The morning replayed itself inside, his mind with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the dispatch call, the assumptions, the cautious commands, and the older man who had answered every question with patience instead of resentment. Now, watching Marcus surrounded by families whose gratitude could never fully be measured, Ethan found himself wondering how many extraordinary lives passed unnoticed every single day simply because people stopped looking beyond first impressions. Daniel Hayes quietly stepped beside him. Neither officer felt the need to speak immediately. The silence between them carried its own conversation. After several moments, Daniel finally exhaled slowly. I have been wearing this badge for 8 years, he said softly. I always believed experience would keep me from making careless judgments. Ethan lowered his eyes. Experience only matters if we keep learning from it. Their words disappeared into the gentle wind without disturbing the peaceful ceremony unfolding ahead. Marcus slowly knelt once more before the monument, adjusting a single folded letter that had shifted slightly beside the wreath. The movement was simple, almost invisible, yet filled with remarkable tenderness. General Whitmore noticed it and smiled faintly. He remembered seeing that exact gesture decades earlier in distant places where Marcus had quietly written letters to families before writing reports to headquarters. Some habits never changed because they were never built from duty alone. They were built from compassion. Ryan Cooper glanced toward the officers standing in the distance. He could see the change settling across their faces, not through shame alone, but through reflection. He had witnessed that same transformation in young soldiers who discovered that true leadership rarely announced itself with loud voices or polished medals. More often, it appeared through patience when patience was hardest to offer and dignity when dignity seemed least deserved. The morning sunlight climbed higher above the memorial, warming the polished stone beneath Marcus's feet. Tiny reflections shimmered across the brass latch of the wooden presentation case, creating brief flashes of light that danced across the granite like quiet reminders that even old memories could continue illuminating new hearts. No photographer called for attention. No reporter interrupted the moment. No one seemed interested in headlines anymore. The only sounds remaining were the breeze, distant birds settling among the trees, and the gentle flutter of countless flags moving together beneath an open American sky. Marcus finally rose to his feet again, taking one long look across the families gathered before him. His calm expression never changed, but something in his eyes suggested he had already forgiven a misunderstanding that others were still struggling to forgive themselves for. Even so, he sensed that the morning had not quite reached its true ending, because behind him he heard slow, deliberate footsteps approaching across the stone walkway. The footsteps stopped only a few feet behind Marcus Ellison. He turned slowly and found Officer Ethan Brooks standing with his service cap held respectfully in both hands. Daniel Hayes stood beside him, equally quiet, his usual confidence replaced by thoughtful humility. Neither officer seemed concerned about the hundreds of people watching. For the first time that morning, they appeared concerned only with doing what was right. Ethan drew a slow breath before speaking. "General Ellison, may I say something?" Marcus offered a gentle nod. "Of course." Ethan glanced briefly toward the families gathered around the memorial before returning his eyes to Marcus. "When we arrived this morning, I believed I was evaluating a situation. Looking back now, I realize I was also making assumptions that I should never have allowed to guide my judgment. I cannot change how today began, but I wanted to tell you that I sincerely regret it." The courtyard remained completely silent. There were no whispers, no shifting feet, no restless movement. Every person seemed to understand that this moment mattered just as much as the ceremony itself. Daniel stepped forward next. "I became a police officer because I wanted people to feel protected when they saw the uniform. This morning, I forgot that respect begins before authority does. I am sorry, sir." Marcus studied both men for several quiet seconds. His expression remained calm, neither triumphant nor disappointed. He looked beyond their uniforms and saw two human beings willing to examine themselves in front of strangers. That required a different kind of courage. General Nathan Whitmore observed the exchange without interruption. Ryan Cooper remained motionless with the honor detail, though a faint smile crossed his face. He had served under Marcus long enough to know exactly what would happen next. Marcus stepped closer until only a few feet separated him from the officers. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "every profession gives us opportunities to make decisions. The important question is not whether we make mistakes. It is whether we allow those mistakes to make us wiser." Ethan swallowed quietly. Marcus continued, "Many years ago, when I was a young lieutenant, I believed I understood people after only a few conversations. An older sergeant corrected me." Marcus smiled at the memory. "He told me something I have never forgotten. He said, 'Son, the quickest way to misunderstand someone is to decide who they are before you decide to listen.'" A few people in the crowd nodded almost instinctively. The words settled over the memorial with gentle clarity. Marcus looked directly at Ethan. Today gave you something valuable. Not embarrassment. Perspective. Do not waste it. Ethan's eyes grew noticeably brighter. I will not, sir. Marcus then turned toward Daniel. Tomorrow morning, someone will cross your path carrying a story you cannot see. Give that story a chance before you give it a label. Daniel slowly nodded. I promise I will remember that. General Whitmore finally stepped beside Marcus and addressed the two officers with quiet authority. The public often measures character by how someone acts when everything goes well. Those who have served long enough know that real character is revealed after an error, when a person chooses honesty over pride. Neither officer attempted to defend himself. They simply listened. Around the memorial, several Gold Star families exchanged gentle smiles. An elderly veteran standing near the front quietly removed a small challenge coin from his pocket and pressed it into Ethan's hand as he walked past. Keep this, he said warmly. Not because you were perfect today, but because you chose to grow. Ethan looked down at the worn coin resting in his palm. Its edges had been smoothed by decades of service. He closed his fingers around it carefully, understanding that its value had nothing to do with metal. Marcus picked up the wooden presentation case once more and looked across the peaceful hillside, where sunlight now illuminated every white headstone in quiet rows. The breeze lifted the flags again, their gentle movement filling the silence between old sacrifices and new understanding. For the first time since the morning had begun, the weight everyone carried seemed just a little lighter. The ceremony gradually came to a close, but no one seemed eager to leave. Small groups of families remained near the memorial, quietly sharing photographs, memories, and embraces that words could never fully replace. The bright autumn sun had climbed higher above the trees, washing the marble hillside in warm light that softened every shadow. Marcus Ellison closed the wooden presentation case one final time and secured the brass latch with familiar care before turning toward the path leading back to the parking area. He had taken only a few steps when he heard someone call his name. General Ellison. He stopped and looked back. Officer Ethan Brooks and Officer Daniel Hayes were walking toward him again, though this time there was no uncertainty in their stride. Ethan carried a small folded American flag that had been resting on a nearby ceremonial table after the remembrance service. He paused a respectful distance away. Sir, one of the Gold Star families asked us to give this to you. They said you have spent years returning memories to others, but they wanted you to know that your kindness has become part of their family's story too. Marcus accepted the folded flag with both hands, his expression softening as he looked at the careful folds of red, white, and blue fabric. For the first time that morning, his eyes lingered downward a little longer than usual. Please thank them for me, he said quietly. That means more than they probably realize. Daniel reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small notebook. It looked ordinary except for the worn pages that suggested years of daily use. Would you mind writing something for us? He asked. Marcus smiled gently. What would you like me to write? Daniel glanced briefly at Ethan before answering. Something we should remember every time we put on the uniform. Marcus remained silent for several thoughtful moments. Then he accepted the notebook and borrowed Ethan's pen. His handwriting was steady, deliberate, and remarkably simple. After finishing, he handed the notebook back without reading the words aloud. Ethan looked down at the page. It contained only one sentence. See the person before you see the assumption. Neither officer spoke immediately. The sentence did not need explanation. It was short enough to remember and deep enough to shape an entire career. Ethan carefully closed the notebook as though protecting something fragile. I think I will carry this every day, he said. Marcus nodded. Then it has already done its job. Nearby, General Nathan Whitmore watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Ryan Cooper walked over carrying the ceremonial wreath stand, now empty after the flowers had been placed at the monument. Sir, Ryan said with a smile, you always seem to leave people carrying something valuable. Marcus looked toward the families slowly making their way through the memorial grounds. I hope it is never guilt, he replied. Guilt fades. Understanding lasts much longer. Whitmore smiled. That is why people still follow your example, even without orders. A gentle breeze swept across the walkway again, lifting a few golden leaves into the air before settling them softly beside the path. The little girl who had earlier asked her grandmother about Marcus suddenly ran over holding a single white flower. She stopped in front of him, looking up with innocent curiosity. My grandma said you remember people. Marcus knelt so they were at eye level. I tried to. The little girl offered him the flower with both hands. Then I want you to remember my grandpa too. Marcus accepted the flower. Carefully. I promise I will. The child smiled brightly before returning to her family. Ethan watched the exchange in complete silence. He realized that no medal, title, or rank had earned Marcus the respect filling the memorial that morning. It had been built one person at a time through decades of compassion, humility, and unwavering character. As the visitors slowly departed beneath the clear blue sky, Marcus tucked the small white flower gently beside the folded flag he now carried, protecting both with the same quiet care, as though every act of remembrance, no matter how small, deserved exactly the same honor. Marcus Ellison walked slowly toward the parking lot, the polished wooden presentation case resting beneath one arm, the folded American flag, and the small white flower carefully protected in his other hand. The crowds behind him gradually dispersed into quiet conversations as families returned to their lives carrying old memories that somehow felt lighter than they had only a few hours before. The brilliant afternoon sun stretched across the memorial grounds, turning every white headstone into a quiet reflection of light. Nothing about the hillside demanded attention. It simply stood there, peaceful and enduring, reminding every visitor that the greatest stories often rested in silence rather than applause. Ryan Cooper opened the passenger door of the military transport before Marcus reached it. "Ready whenever you are, sir," he said warmly. Marcus smiled but did not step inside. Instead, he turned one final time to look across the long rows of marble stretching toward the horizon. "There are never enough visits," he said softly. Ryan followed his gaze. "No, sir." General Nathan Whitmore approached, extending his hand once more. "Same time next year." Marcus accepted the handshake with quiet familiarity. "As long as I am able to walk through those gates, I will be here." Whitmore nodded with deep respect. "Then we will keep saving your place." The two old soldiers exchanged one final smile before Whitmore returned to his waiting sedan. A short distance away, Ethan Brooks and Daniel Hayes remained standing beside their patrol vehicle. Neither officer had rushed back to ordinary duties. They simply watched as Marcus prepared to leave, knowing that the morning had quietly changed something inside both of them. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed the small notebook once again. He opened it to the single handwritten sentence Marcus had left behind. "See the person before you see the assumption." He read the words silently, then closed the notebook with careful hands before placing it back inside his uniform pocket over his heart. Daniel noticed the gesture and smiled faintly. "That is probably the most important thing I have carried all year." Ethan looked across the memorial one last time. "I think it may be the most important thing I carry for the rest of my career." Marcus heard neither comment. He did not need to. Some lessons were complete the moment they began living inside another person. Ryan gently closed the vehicle door after Marcus settled into the passenger seat, the wooden presentation case resting securely on his lap. The engine started quietly, disturbing neither the peaceful hillside nor the lingering stillness surrounding the memorial. As the transport slowly rolled toward the exit, visitors along the walkway noticed Marcus through the window. An elderly veteran wearing a faded service cap stopped walking and raised a simple salute. Marcus immediately returned it with calm precision. A young Marine standing nearby saw the exchange and instinctively saluted as well. Then another service member did the same. Within moments, without commands, announcements, or ceremony, a quiet line of respectful salutes followed the departing vehicle until it disappeared beyond the stone entrance. Ethan watched until the transport was no longer visible. Only then did he look back toward the luxury SUV that had remained parked exactly where the morning had begun. It was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a reminder of how quickly appearances could mislead and how deeply humility could transform a single day. A maintenance worker slowly swept a few golden leaves from the parking lot, including the place where everything had first unfolded. Within minutes, there was no sign that anything unusual had happened there at all. No crowd remained. No cameras lingered. Only clean pavement beneath the warm afternoon light. Yet something invisible had stayed behind. A little more understanding. A little less judgment. And somewhere beyond the memorial gates, one quiet man carried home a folded flag, a single white flower, and the same promise he had honored for decades: proving once again that true greatness is never measured by how loudly the world recognizes you, but by how gently you choose to recognize the worth in everyone else.